"We don't treat people like you," Dr. William Carter said without slowing down, his voice flat, dismissive, as the soaked black woman reached for the ER door and was blocked by security under the harsh white hospital lights. She didn't argue, didn't beg, just stood there breathing steadily, eyes sharp in a way no one bothered to notice. While inside the lobby, nurses whispered and a child stared at her like he recognized something no adult could see. Carter signed a chart, already moving on, already forgetting her. The power gap absolute, clean, unquestioned, but as she turned slightly, her voice slipped out, calm and precise. "Your triage is missing something." And for a second, just a second, the nearest nurse hesitated, something in the tone too exact, too trained. Then alarms cut through the air as a patient crashed down the hall, tension snapping tight, staff rushing. Carter stepping forward as the unquestioned authority while the woman outside watched through the glass. Unreadable, unshaken. Rain traced lines down the window like silent witnesses as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn card, fingers brushing over a name almost erased. Then without a word she dropped it onto the wet pavement and turned away from the hospital entrance, choosing to walk into the darkness instead of forcing her way in. And inside, as chaos escalated and no one could stabilize the patient fast enough, one question began to rise, quiet but dangerous. Who exactly had DR? Carter just turned away. Inside the emergency room, the monitors kept screaming and the rhythm would not stabilize, forcing Dr. Carter to repeat the same adjustments twice as sweat gathered at his collar, something slipping just beyond his control while a nurse whispered that the patient had been stable minutes ago, stable until the delay at the entrance slowed everything down. The room tightened, every second stretching, and for the first time that night Carter hesitated, just a fraction, just enough for another doctor to step in and suggest a different approach, one that sounded unfamiliar but strangely precise, echoing the exact tone of the woman outside. And the nurse froze before saying quietly that the same correction had been muttered through the glass earlier. Carter brushed it off, but the procedure took longer than it should have, and when it finally settled, no one celebrated, because it should have been faster, cleaner, easier. Something had been missing, and everyone felt it. Back in the hallway, security bent down to pick up the worn card left in the rain, the ink faint but readable, and when he handed it to the front desk, the clerk's expression changed without a word, fingers pausing over the keyboard before pulling up an archived file that had not been accessed in years. Meanwhile, Carter walked past, unaware that behind him the system had just flagged a name with restricted access clearance, a name tied to surgical protocols still used in the hospital today. A young resident glanced at the screen and whispered, almost to herself, that those methods had saved hundreds of patients, methods no one on staff had ever fully mastered. Carter stopped when he heard it. Just for a second, something cold brushing the back of his thoughts, but he kept walking, choosing certainty over doubt, until another alarm went off down the hall, sharper this time, more urgent, and someone said under their breath that if that woman had been inside, this would have already been under control, and for the first time that night the question did not feel small anymore. It felt dangerous. Where had she gone, and what exactly had he just lost by letting her walk away? Across town, under warm yellow lights instead of sterile white, a small private clinic buzzed with quiet urgency as a senior physician paused mid-sentence, eyes fixed on the woman standing near the reception desk, no longer shaking from the rain, her posture straight, her voice calm as she explained a complication others had overlooked. The room shifted almost instantly, nurses stepping closer, one of them asking her to repeat the assessment, not out of doubt but respect, and when she did, the physician nodded without hesitation and said they would proceed exactly as she suggested, a subtle transfer of authority that did not go unnoticed. Minutes later, the patient stabilized faster than expected, and someone whispered that they had not seen a correction that precise in years, not since the protocols written by a name few dared to mention. Amara did not smile, did not claim anything. She simply stepped back. But the way the staff looked at her had already changed, curiosity replacing dismissal, attention replacing indifference. A young intern hurried after her, asking if she was available for consultation, offering a card, calling her doctor before even confirming it. And for the first time that night, the world around her adjusted to meet her value instead of denying it. Across the city, Inside the hospital, Dr. Carter stood still as a colleague pulled him aside and quietly mentioned that another facility had just resolved a critical case using a method identical to the one dismissed earlier. The same phrasing, the same precision, and something unsettled tightened in his chest as the pieces refused to stay separate. Back at the clinic, a director approached Amara with a formal invitation to review their surgical protocols, her name now spoken carefully, almost cautiously, as if they were beginning to understand who they were standing in front of. And as she accepted with a simple nod, the contrast became undeniable. She was no longer being turned away from doors. Doors were beginning to open for her. And just as she stepped inside, unseen by Carter, but moving closer to a world he controlled, a question surfaced that could no longer be ignored. How long before he is forced to face the woman everyone else is already beginning to recognize? The conference room fell quiet the moment Dr. William Carter stepped inside, but not because of him, because every eye had already shifted toward the woman standing at the head of the table, composed, steady, no trace of the rain-soaked figure he had dismissed hours ago. He stopped mid-step, confusion flickering across his face as the clinic director greeted her first, not him, offering a respectful nod and introducing her with a tone that carried weight. And for a second Carter did not recognize her, not until she turned slightly and the memory hit him all at once, sharp and disorienting. The imbalance cracked instantly, his authority no longer filling the room the way it always had, because no one moved to accommodate him, no one rushed to hand him control. Instead, they waited for her to continue speaking. She did not react to his presence, not even a glance at first, continuing her explanation of a surgical protocol adjustment that drew quiet agreement from the senior staff, each nod reinforcing something Carter could not yet name. When he finally spoke, questioning the approach with controlled skepticism, she answered without raising her voice, precise, measured, and undeniable, correcting him in front of everyone without a hint of confrontation, and the room did not defend him. It listened to her. A junior physician leaned forward and said they had already seen the results earlier that day, that her method had stabilized a case no one else could manage, and the words landed harder than any accusation. Carter felt it then, not anger, not yet, but something unfamiliar, a shift he could not control, as if the ground beneath his certainty had tilted. She finally looked at him, calm, unreadable, and said quietly, "You are used to being the final answer, but that only works when you are right." And no one interrupted, no one disagreed. The contrast was complete. The woman he had turned away was now the one everyone deferred to, and the silence around him was no longer respect. It was distance. As the meeting moved forward without needing him, Carter realized he was no longer leading the room. He was catching up to it. And when the director handed her a sealed file marked with restricted clearance and said they had been waiting for her approval to proceed, Carter's breath slowed, a new question forming, heavier than before. What else had she built, and how far ahead of him had she already moved? The shift did not happen quietly. It happened in front of everyone, under bright clinical lights where authority was supposed to be unquestioned. As a critical case was rolled into the room, and all eyes instinctively turned to Dr. Carter, waiting for him to take control the way he always had. But before he could speak, the clinic director stepped aside and looked directly at Amara, a small gesture that changed everything. She moved forward without hesitation, not rushing, not proving, simply stepping into place as if she had always belonged there. And the staff followed her lead without needing instruction, their movements aligning with hers in a way that felt practiced, almost familiar. Carter spoke once, attempting to redirect the approach, but his voice did not anchor the room this time. It hovered, then fell away as one of his own colleagues said they should proceed with her plan because it had already worked, because they trusted her judgment, and that word trust landed, heavier than any title he carried. Amara did not look at him when she adjusted the process. Her focus remained on the patient, her tone calm and exact. And within minutes the instability eased faster than expected, a visible outcome no one could argue with. A nurse exhaled in relief and said quietly that she had never seen it handled that cleanly, and another added that the technique matched archive protocols that only a handful of people had ever mastered. And suddenly the recognition was no longer subtle. It was spoken, shared, undeniable. Carter stood there, not removed, but no longer central, watching as decisions formed without him, as outcomes improved without his direction. And for the first time, the structure around him did not depend on his presence. It adapted without him. After the case, the director addressed the room and formally acknowledged Amara's authority to review and implement procedural changes across departments. A statement made openly, professionally, in front of witnesses who immediately accepted it, some even nodding with quiet relief, as if something overdue had finally been corrected. Carter felt the shift settle deeper, not just in perception but in position, as if the ground he had built his certainty on was no longer exclusively his. He stepped forward then, asking a controlled question about her credentials, about where she had trained, but before she could answer, the system screen behind them refreshed with a secured file already unlocked under her clearance, displaying a series of surgical models and authorship records that traced back years, all tied to her name. The room went still. Again, not in confusion this time, but in recognition, and Carter's question no longer sounded like authority. It sounded like he was catching up. Amara finally turned to him, her expression steady, and said only, "You are asking the wrong question," before closing the file with a single motion, and as the director mentioned that a board-level review was scheduled for her later that evening, one that would determine control over multiple hospital networks, the realization pressed in harder than before. If this was only what she allowed them to see now, then what part of her past had he just dismissed, and how much of his future was already slipping out of his hands? The file did not close completely before Dr. Carter reached for it again, his hand slower this time, less certain, as if something inside it had already begun to shift his understanding. The screen lit back up, and what he expected to be credentials turned into something else entirely, a timeline of surgical breakthroughs, protocol revisions, and clinical trials that he recognized immediately, because he had built his reputation on them, presented them at conferences, signed his name beneath them, believed they were his defining work. But now, layered beneath each entry, in smaller print, in archived authorship notes and restricted annotations, was the same name repeated over and over, Amara Johnson, listed not as an assistant, not as a contributor, but as the original architect behind the methodologies he had used for years. His breath slowed as he scrolled, each line dismantling something he had never questioned, each note revealing that the procedures credited to him had been stabilized, corrected, or entirely redesigned before they ever reached his hands. A colleague stepped closer, reading over his shoulder, and said quietly that those protocols had always felt ahead of their time, that no one had fully understood how they worked, only that they did, and now it made sense. Carter did not respond, because the realization was no longer abstract. It was specific, undeniable, tied to moments he remembered too clearly, cases where outcomes had improved unexpectedly, where complications had resolved faster than predicted, where he had been praised for precision he now could not fully explain. Across the room, another physician added that the original designer of those systems had disappeared years ago under unclear circumstances, that her work had been absorbed, republished, redistributed, until her name became difficult to trace, almost erased, and yet still essential to everything they practiced. Carter stepped back slightly, the room no longer feeling like a place he controlled, but a structure he had misunderstood, built partly on something he had never seen. He looked toward the door where Amara had exited earlier, and for the first time the memory of that moment outside the hospital did not feel small. It felt irreversible, as if he had not just dismissed a person, but severed himself from the source of something critical. A senior administrator entered then, holding a sealed document, confirming that Amara had been scheduled to present directly to the governing board that evening, not as a candidate, but as a decision-maker reviewing system-wide authority transitions. And the implications settled heavily, because this was no longer about recognition, it was about control shifting. At a level he could not easily reach, Carter closed the file. Slowly, his certainty replaced by a quiet, unfamiliar weight, as a single question took hold, sharper than any before. If everything he had built was tied to her unseen work, then what happens when she decides to take it back? And what will he have left when she does? Dr. Carter did not wait for the scheduled meeting. He moved through the building faster than he ever had, past staff who no longer stepped aside the way they used to, his name no longer clearing a path the same way it once did, until he reached the secured conference level where access required authorization he did not automatically have. He pushed through anyway. Urgency overriding protocol. Catching sight of Amara just as she stepped out of a private room surrounded by board members who spoke to her with measured respect, their tone careful, their attention fixed on her as if she were the one setting direction. Amara, he said, the name unfamiliar on his own voice, sharper than intended, and for the first time he was the one trying to be heard. She paused, not surprised, not unsettled, simply turning to face him as the others instinctively gave her space. Not him. He began quickly, words overlapping, explaining the file, the protocols, how there must have been a misunderstanding, how he had built on what was already there, how none of it had been intentional, the urgency clear, the control gone. She listened without interrupting, her expression steady, her silence forcing him to fill it, and when he finished, the absence of her reaction felt heavier than any accusation. You built on it, she said finally, calm, precise, but you never asked where it came from, and the sentence landed clean, leaving no room to push back. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, trying to regain ground, offering collaboration, offering to correct records, to restore credit, to fix what he now understood had been taken. But she did not move toward him. She did not soften. She simply held her position, and that stillness created a boundary more solid than anything he could argue through. A board member approached then, quietly reminding her that they were ready to proceed, addressing her first, not acknowledging him at all, reinforcing the shift without needing to explain it. Carter's voice tightened as he tried again, asking what she wanted, what it would take to make this right. And for a brief second something flickered in his tone, not authority, not confidence, but something closer to uncertainty. Amara met his eyes fully this time and said, access is not something you request after you ignored it when it mattered. Her words controlled, not raised, but final. The imbalance from before had reversed completely. He was the one reaching. She was the one deciding. Security stepped closer, not aggressively, just enough to signal that his presence was no longer assumed, and the realization settled deeper. He could not step into her space the way he once had, could not redirect her, could not define her role anymore. As she turned to re-enter the room, the door opening for her without hesitation, Carter remained where he was, the distance between them no longer physical but structural, and as the door closed, sealing her inside a decision that no longer included him. One question pressed harder than anything else. What exactly was she about to decide that would make his position impossible to recover? The door opened again, slower this time, and when Amara stepped out, the room behind her had already made its decision. The shift complete, the direction set, and Dr. Carter was still there waiting, no longer trying to interrupt, no longer trying to control, just standing in a place that no longer belonged to him. I need to understand, he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of certainty. And for the first time it sounded less like authority and more like someone asking to be allowed closer. She stopped a few feet away, not distant, but not inviting, her posture steady, her gaze level, giving him space to speak but not offering him access. He took a breath and said it plainly, that he had built his career on work he did not fully recognize, that he had overlooked her, dismissed her, and that he was wrong, not just in action but in judgment, and the admission hung there, direct, unprotected, real. She did not react immediately, and that pause carried weight, not hesitation but clarity, as if she had already processed this long before he found the words. You were not wrong for not knowing my name, she said, calm, grounded. You were wrong for deciding I had none, and the truth landed without force, without anger, leaving no room to argue. He stepped closer, not aggressively, but with something unsteady beneath the movement, asking if there was any way to correct it, to rebuild, to work together, to be part of what she was now leading. And in that moment it was clear, he was no longer offering position, he was asking for it. Amara held his gaze, and there was no hostility there, only finality, the kind that does not need to raise its voice. What I built does not need to return to where it was ignored, she said, each word measured, each one closing a door he could not reopen. and I do not go back to places that could not see me when I was standing in front of them. The imbalance was complete, not just in status, but in meaning, because she was no longer responding to him. She was defining her path without him in it. Carter exhaled slowly, the understanding settling in fully now. Not partial, not uncertain, but complete. He had not just lost recognition, he had lost relevance in her world, and nothing he said could restore it. Around them, staff moved with quiet awareness, giving her space, acknowledging her presence, while he remained still, no longer the center of anything. She turned then, not abruptly, not emotionally, simply moving forward, and as she walked away, one of the board members approached her with final documents to sign, documents that would formalize her authority across systems he once believed he controlled. Carter watched, not trying to stop her this time, because he understood that the moment had already passed, and as she reached for the pen without looking back, one final question remained, quiet but absolute. When she signs, what part of his world will no longer belong to him at all? The pen touched the paper without hesitation, and in that quiet motion the transition became real, not announced, not argued, simply done, as Amara signed her name with the same steady control she had carried through every moment that led her here, and the room shifted around her, not in surprise, but in alignment, because this was no longer a question of who she was, it was a recognition of what she had already become. Conversations adjusted to include her direction, decisions waited for her input, and when she stood, people made space not out of obligation but respect, a quiet acknowledgement that her presence now shaped outcomes far beyond a single room or system. Across the hall, Dr. Carter remained where he had been. The distance between them no longer measured in steps, but in everything that had changed, his posture still, his expression settled into something quieter than frustration, something closer to understanding, as he watched the structure he once moved through effortlessly continue without him at its center. There was no scene, no confrontation left to unfold, only the weight of what had already passed. And in that stillness he began to see the contrast clearly. The moment at the hospital door where he had decided what she was worth, and the moment now where that decision no longer held any meaning at all. A nurse passed by him without pausing, following Amara's direction down the corridor, and the simplicity of it made the shift undeniable. She was no longer someone being evaluated. She was the one others relied on. Inside, Amara reviewed final documents. Her voice calm, her focus forward, not once looking back toward where he stood, because there was nothing behind her that required her attention anymore. Her position was not built on proving anything to him. It was built on the work she had always carried, now seen, now acknowledged, now fully her own. Carter exhaled slowly, not in defeat, but in recognition, as the last assumption he had held onto gave way, leaving behind a clearer truth he could not ignore, that what he had lost was not a chance to correct a mistake, but access to something he had never truly understood. The lights reflected softly against the glass as Amara walked past it, her reflection steady, uninterrupted, moving forward without hesitation, while his remained behind, unchanged, separated not by distance but by timing. And as the doors closed gently between them, the final understanding settled in place. He had learned who she was, but he had learned it too late, and she no longer needed to be seen by him at all.